Scripture reader.
Can you hear me? Okay. We good back there? Are we live? Okay. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 22. We're going to read all the way down to 38, and then chapter 9 in the first verse. And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees, walking. And after that, he put his hands again upon his eyes, and made him look up. And he was restored, and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, Neither go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town. And Jesus went out, and his disciples unto the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And by the way he asked his disciples, saying unto them, Who do men say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elias, and others one of the prophets. And he saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? And Peter answered and said unto him, Thou art the Christ. And he charged them that they should tell no man of him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes, and be killed after 3 days rise again. And he spake that saying openly, and Peter took him and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned about and looked on his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. And when he had called the people unto him with his disciples also, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generations, of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when he cometh into the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that there be some of them that stand here which shall not taste of death till they have seen the kingdom of God come with power. This is the word of the Lord.
Excellent. Thank you, all of you that participated this morning, especially those in the open meeting this morning. It was really good. Several really good messages that I found useful, so I'm very happy about all that. So now we're in Mark. We're, like Mike said last week, we're essentially dead center of the book, textually speaking. We're actually about 3/4 of the way through the life, or the ministry, I should say, of Christ. So we're approaching chronologically, if you're trying to keep track of where you are in the actual ministry of Jesus, you're at about starting the last year of his ministry. And so the last half of the book of Mark is going to deal with 1 year of the life of Christ. And so that's kind of how Mark has it broken out. So we're about halfway through the the book as textually speaking, and we're about 3/4 of the way through as it corresponds to the actual life of Jesus. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And Mark has been slowly building this gospel, his writing. He's been slowly putting together these pericopes, these stories, these little vignettes. He's been building them and assembling them, and they've been growing. I don't know if you've noticed this. If you should just read through the book of Mark complete, just take a day and just read through. It'll take you probably maybe an hour and a half to read it. It's not that long. But if you read it, I think you'll notice that he's been growing and everything's been intensifying. And it kind of comes to this point right here at the halfway where everything's been building to this. And there's a number of little subtexts. Excuse me one second. There's a number of small subtexts that he's been running as threads throughout the text, throughout his stories, that he's going to tie them together here in this passage. So he's going to take all these, not all of them, but many of the strands that he's been weaving in and out of the stories and the teachings of Jesus. He's going to bring them all up. He's going to tie a big knot on them here at the end. And we're going to look at that and what that means. But if you look at it, even the ministries in the life of Christ have been changing quite dramatically, although slowly, but dramatically changing from the beginning. For instance, in chapter 2, when he's healing somebody, he says something like, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." And now in our text, he's turning around to Peter saying, "You're Satan." So obviously, right, there's an intensification going on here. In the very first miracles, he's barely touching the infirm, and now he's spitting on them and rubbing mud all over their faces. I mean, things have intensified quite a bit in this. And that's kind of like basic training, and that we could kind of look at how Mark is set up and what Jesus is doing. And we could almost look at these first 8 chapters as being a basic training course. And pressure's building, right? And your sleep is more and more being deprived, and the temperature is getting worse and worse, and everything's getting harder and harder and harder. And that's kind of what we see through the first 8 chapters of Mark. And he's going to bring it all to a boiling head here at the end of our text. And the reason why is because they have the reason why Mark has been building the way it has, I think, is because he's going to test them in our text in 3 very important ways. And we're not going to look at them very much in depth. I just want to run them through quickly. I have some other things I would like to point out to you. But he's going to give them 3 important tests. The first one is he's going to test their knowledge. And that is he's going to ask them a question. And the question he's going to ask them is very offensive. This is why he's been conditioning them to learn to accept offense, because he's going to ask them a very offensive question. And that question is, who am I? Now, we should all be able to identify with why that would irk you for someone to ask you that. If you're at work and a customer tells you, "Do you know who I am?" Well, you don't really think they're lost, right? You don't really think they've misplaced their identification and they don't know who they are. They're trying to tell you something, and you don't like what they're trying to tell you, right? They're trying to tell you they're somebody and you're nobody. That's what they're trying to tell you. So when Jesus turns and he tells the disciple, but even beyond that, right, you can look at it and say, and Tim Keller, in one of his teachings on this text, he points this out, and I thought it was very interesting. But basically, imagine you went to college, and you were there for 4 years, or 3 years in their case, right? They've been with Jesus for 3 years. Intensified study. I mean, seriously, day and night study, learning. And he says, okay, if you can answer this question, it shows you've learned everything I have to teach you. Imagine if you're at college and your professor after 3 years tells you this. If you can answer this one question, you will have learned everything there is that you could possibly ever know that's useful to you. Who am I? I think you'd want your money back. I think you'd want a refund. Like, that is not the question you're expecting, but that's the question Jesus has for them. After 3 years of my teaching, let's see if you've learned what you're supposed to know. Who am I? Who am I? And so he's testing their knowledge. Second thing he's going to test is their readiness. And this is what all soldiers are tested for. Soldiers train and train and train, often much like policemen, even policemen perhaps more. I know policemen who have never fired their weapon in anger or in pursuit of crime, right? But they shoot thousands and thousands of rounds to be ready. And this is what Jesus has done. He's brought them into a state of readiness. And now he says, and this is why you need to be ready, because the Son of Man is going to be betrayed, he's going to suffer, and he's going to be killed. Are you ready? He's going to be rejected. He's going to be hated. This is happening. This is coming very quickly. Are you ready? This is what he's asking them. And the third thing he's going to test them on is their commitment, because then he tells them, you need to take up your cross and follow me, which is probably the most offensive statement that Jesus ever made, even though that's not the one that we take the most offense at, which is interesting. That should be the most offensive statement you've probably ever heard in your life. But oddly, that's not the one that most people take the most offense at. But this is what he's doing. He's testing their commitment. He is saying, I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to suffer the most ignominious death imaginable, and I want you to come with me in it. Now, it might seem with these tests that Jesus is deliberately making the gospel difficult. And so Mark, I think, responds to that possible accusation or concern in two ways. First, he isn't. Jesus is not deliberately or artificially making the gospel difficult, because the gospel is difficult. Jesus is just illustrating the difficulty of the gospel. I was talking with Terry about this, and she reminded me of a really, really great line in a film that we both like called A League of Their Own. Perhaps some of you have seen it. But it's where the Tom Hanks character, his name is Jimmy in the film, he's the manager of this all-women's baseball team, right? And the star player of that team has decided to quit for various reasons, and she's packing up, and he's coming trying to convince her not to quit. And her argument of why she's quitting when he asks her is, it just got to be too hard. To which he responds, it's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would do it. It's the hard that makes it great. Now that's baseball. Now baseball could be anything we wanted it to be. Baseball doesn't have to be hard. Baseball could be easy. We could make baseball where anyone could be a professional player, but then probably nobody would watch it. That's not what's happening with Jesus. Jesus isn't trying to artificially weed out people so that he can have an elite crew or an elite group of people. It's not artificially hard. The gospel is hard. It's innately hard. To make it easy, to remove the difficulty from the gospel would be to make it something other than the gospel, and something that addresses something other than life. The reason the gospel is hard is because your life is hard. The reason the gospel is hard is because your problems are hard. When somebody comes and tells you they want to make the gospel easy and simple, what they're really telling you is they want to make you and your life and your problems easy and simple. Because easy life, easy problems only require easy solutions. If you have a really thorny problem, a really hard problem, you need a real serious person with some serious tools. And that's probably not going to be easy. It's probably going to be complicated, and it's certainly going to be difficult. So Jesus is not making it hard. It is hard because it deals with hard realities and hard problems. Second thing that I think Mark does is that whatever appearance of difficulty that Jesus is introducing, he's doing so because it's required for success. If you're going to be successful in the gospel, you're going to have to condition yourself for the difficulty that is coming with it. You're going to have to condition yourself. Yeah, maybe Jesus could have used a canteen of water instead of spitting on the guy's face and, rubbing that on his eyes. You think, well, surely somebody had a bottle of water handy, right? Surely Jesus could have used a metaphor a little less prickly than we can't give the children's bread to the dogs. I mean, surely he could come up with a better, more politically correct way of making that point than just, making it sound like he's just calling her a dog. Surely there was a less mean way of rebuking Peter than to turn around in front of all his friends and say, "You're Satan." I mean, surely there was a way that could be done with a little more tact. I think surely I've been told that tact is possible. I've never experienced it myself, but my wife tells me all the time that such a thing does exist. Somewhere out there in the wild, there is something called tact. It's also possible that you could train a bunch of Navy SEALs, right, with warmer water and lighter loads, a little less yelling, a little more sleep. Maybe Hell Week isn't necessary. Maybe you can train them just as good, a little more tenderly. However, Jesus needs to prepare them for real offense, real hardship. If they're not able to take strong words from a friend, if they can't handle challenging puzzles from a loving instructor, how are they going to survive what was coming in just a short amount of time? What was coming was a violent, catastrophic upheaval of the cosmic order. That's what was coming. A violent, catastrophic upheaval of the entire cosmic order, not just the political order or the economic or the social order. Yeah, all of that's true also, but on top of that, the physical and spiritual order. Everything you know, both physically and spiritually, as the world was going to be turned upside down and inside out, Jesus was going to rip it limb from limb and remake the whole thing. This was not going to happen gently or serenely, and the world was not going to go peacefully into that good night. Jesus was going to take the most basic and accepted realities. He's going to completely reimagine them and remake them. I'm talking about death and life itself. Heaven and earth itself, everything was going to be rolled up like a scroll, was going to be taken up like a huge blueprint, scrunched down into a little ball, and then remade completely new with such violent force that places like Revelation and Hebrews talk about it as being a great sound and the entire heaven shaking. Imagine the whole world is convulsing and is flailing about. And Jesus has got the whole thing and he's just ripping it to pieces. He wanted them to be ready for that type of war that was coming. Jesus was on a collision course with reality as you and everyone else has known it, in which he was going to recreate reality. It was not going to be gentle or serene, and therefore the gospel is not a lullaby. If the gospel we're hearing, if the gospel that we're presenting, if the gospel that we tell ourselves in our head is smooth and gentle and tender, then we're probably not getting the full gospel. Because when we read the gospels of Matthew and Mark, Luke and John, that certainly is not the message that Jesus was preaching. The gospel that Jesus was preaching was much more akin to the mighty evangelion that we find in the ancient world, where they would send messengers out all over the land to proclaim what a victorious general or victorious emperor had accomplished, and how he had rent a city and starved the inhabitants and beat them into submission. Now, that's not what Jesus was proclaiming, but it had that tone. The tone that Jesus was coming saying is, I am here to bind the strong man. I am here to rip his weapons from his hands. I am here to lead forth captivity. I am here to liberate the poor. I am here to subjugate the strong. I'm here to take everything upside down. Everything the way you knew it is no longer going to be that way. I am going to remake your world from the inside out. And that's not going to happen gently. The last time that happened, even at an extremely small, minuscule scale, was when God remade the world that he had created in the creation, and he remade it in the days of Noah by drowning the entire world in water. Not a gentle flood. There was a time when people thought of the flood as that the water levels just slowly raised, and everything just stayed the way it was, and then they went away. But if anyone has ever witnessed a flood of any magnitude, even a small one in your bathroom, you know that's not how water works. Water is extraordinarily destructive. And that's what Jesus is coming to do. So to tell this type of a story of this remaking of the world, this reimagining, recreating of the world, to tell it in such a way that is gentle and serene, and there's no hardship and there's no offense, and it's always politically correct. Well, that would be like trying to train Navy SEALs, right, with hot stone massages and cucumber avocado facials and day spas. Well, that's not what Jesus is trying to do. The reason why Hell Week is necessary is because of what General Sherman famously, or at least attributed to him, has having famously said. Hell Week is necessary, he says. Well, he didn't say that, but it's necessary because, as he said, war is hell. That's why they take recruits and try to put them as close to that as they possibly can. Because the idea is they'll get to war, and in war, there's no time out. There's no safe word in war. And so they try to pull them right to the edge of that. They're not worried if they get their feelings hurt. This is what we find in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is very unconcerned with you getting your feelings hurt. He is not concerned if anything he says offends you, because he knows you're in for massive offense that nobody can control. And he wants you to be toughened up and ready for it. We should also point out that what blinds us and handicaps us is our propensity to take everything he says so personally. Now, this is a serious problem. It's a problem to this very day. And it's the subtext that we find throughout these first 8 chapters of Mark almost. Almost the entire 8 chapters is slowly building, but this is one of those subtexts, one of those strands that we find in Mark, that people, the reason why they're offended is because they take everything personally. And it's the human condition. Jesus illustrates it, and it really culminates right here in this text, in this last chapter that we've been looking at. Perhaps the best example of this, both in the time of Jesus and right now today, the best example is the Syrophoenician woman that Mike talked about. That is the most offensive verse in the Bible, probably, as far as how many people get offended and how deeply they are offended by it. Jesus tells, for those that don't remember, Jesus tells this Gentile woman comes to Jesus and says, my daughter's sick, can you heal her? And Jesus tells her, let the children eat first. It's not right to give the bread of the children to the dogs. And immediately, almost all of our minds had one question. Who's he calling a dog? Well, the quick answer is he's not calling anybody a dog. That's a metaphor. And the reason we think about, is he calling me, I'm a Gentile, am I a dog? Is because you're taking it personally. Because we take it personally, we miss the point. And that is the ultimate point that Jesus is trying to make all through these last 3 or 4 chapters we've been looking at, over and over and over. There's another example that we just looked at last week. Mike went through it, right, with the leaven. Jesus says to the disciples, look, he's prodding them. I'm not going to pretend that he is throwing cactus prickly pears out there in the path. He's purposefully trying to poke them. But he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. They take it so personally. Oh, it's because we forgot to bring bread. Same thing that we're doing with the Gentile woman. Who's he calling a dog? How dare he call Gentiles dogs? It's because we have not paid attention to what he has said over and over and over throughout this first 8 chapters of Mark. It's many, many times he says very similar thing. For instance, in chapter 4, he told you, take heed what you hear. Pay attention to what you're hearing. Don't just make assumptions. I am going to be speaking very complexly, very difficult. In fact, I am going to intentionally say things that could be taken wrong, intentionally. You think, why would Jesus do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons why Jesus would do that, but a big reason why he would do that is because you're going out into a world that is intent on deceiving you. You need to learn to hear properly. And that's what he says, take heed what you hear. In chapter 6, verse 14, he says, hearken unto him, every one of you, and understand. In verse 16, he says, if any man have ears to hear, let him hear. That redundancy is just an idiomatic way of saying, do not make assumptions. Pay close attention to every detail. And don't take it personally. Don't think that when I say leaven, I'm talking about what you packed for lunch. Don't think that when I use a dog metaphor, I'm referring to you. Think deeper. Think more clearly. Try to think of what I'm trying to explain. Sure, Jesus could have made the point to the Syrophoenician woman in a less offensive way. But just think of how magnificent it came out for her. Now, she's the only one up to this story who does right. She hears what Jesus says, and she doesn't take it personally. Jesus used a metaphor. The metaphor is, don't give to some what doesn't belong to them. I came to my own. My purpose, my whole mission is to the Jews. I should be ministering to them. It wouldn't be right to distract myself from them. Now, he says it in a much more politically incorrect way, but that's essentially what he says. She just accepts that. Not that she's a dog. That's not the point. The point is she says, I understand your metaphor, and let me respond in kind. And when she does, Jesus says, wow, that's great faith. What's the faith? Now, too often it's taught that the faith is that she accepted herself to be a dog. That's not what he's saying. The faith goes in context with all the book of Mark. In the book of Mark, Jesus has made this point over and over. When the apostles, when the disciples, when the Jews misunderstand what Jesus is saying, he says it's because of lack of faith. Her faith was to be able to get over herself, look past herself, not take it personally, and understand what Jesus is trying to explain. And then interact with him, argue with him, converse with him on that level. Jesus wants to have a conversation with you on his level. We want him to have a conversation with us on our level, which is the petty, selfish. Everything's about me. And anytime you say anything that could be construed wrong, it will be construed wrong, and I will have my feelings hurt. And then you must comfort me and tell me you really didn't mean it that way. And Jesus doesn't want to interact on that level. It's why he becomes frustrated with the disciples, with the leaven, and he says, Don't you remember when I made bread and I multiplied it and it all that left? He doesn't even answer. He just says, don't you understand yet? Can't you see past the end of your own nose? Can you just for one moment think that no, not everything I say is all about you? That maybe I'm talking about something bigger than you and better than you? And of course, when he says that, that offends us also. Because we cannot imagine or conceive in our own minds anything more interesting and important and bigger than us. So surely everything must be about us. And Jesus is saying, no. So take heed what you hear. Now, yes, Jesus could have used a metaphor that was much less likely for you to trip over it. But as we've already seen, tripping is in everyone's future. So what Jesus wants to do is teach you how to trip. He wants to teach you how to recover from tripping. And he wants to teach you how to discover something invaluable when you do trip. Jesus put it this way. He actually has a statement he makes all about this. He says, it is impossible for offenses not to come. It's impossible. If you're looking in Christianity for a life without offense, you will not find it. Because that's not a real life. That is a fake life. That is a life of fiction. Jesus wants to give you abundant life. Real life. And real life has real problems. And so he wants you to teach you how to cope with them, how to deal with them, how to succeed in them. Now, all of this that we've talked about is Jesus conditioning us for the hardest saying that he was going to say. The hardest thing that you and I will probably ever hear. And that's the saying of the cross. Actually, there really is two sayings, right? The first one is, and this one often we overlook because it's not as resonant to us because we don't have a 2,000-year-old culture of what it meant to be Messiah. But if you did, if you grew up thinking and talking about Jesus, or about Messiah, and the Messiah coming, and God's anointed one, and reading the prophecies over and over through Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53, and the Psalms, and the Son of David, and all those prophecies, and you grew up reading those, and then you read or you heard what Jesus says here, it would be extraordinarily offensive, scandalous. He says Messiah is going to be rejected by the religious leaders. He's going to suffer and he's going to die. That was blasphemy. Messiah was going to come and be received with great acclamation and apotheosis. He was going to be exalted. He was going to come and he was going to convert all the hearts, just like Peter prophesied, cites the prophecy in Acts. Convert the hearts of the parents to the children. He was going to convert the whole world. He was going to make milk and honey flow again. And Jesus comes and says, no, that's not at all what's going to happen. Now this is offensive even to us today. But Peter took offense at it. Peter says, that should not happen to you. Now, Jesus points out that Peter's concern was not selfless. It was selfish. He made it look like what he really was worried about was Jesus' well-being, but he really wasn't. It was his own well-being. That's why Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. You don't savor the things of God. You're not worried about God and his purpose and his Messiah. You're just worried about yourself and what that would imply. Because think about it for a moment, the true offense of what Jesus is saying. If your Lord was to suffer, what do you think that means for you? Now, this is where modern evangelical doctrine gets its hairs crossed. It's where it gets its wires crossed, where things get kind of screwed up for them or for us. We think commonly, now you might not think that way, I hope you don't, but many of us think this way, that Jesus was going to suffer so we wouldn't ever have to. Jesus was going to die so we wouldn't have to. Jesus was going to carry our cross so we could stand by and watch, but not participate. And that's not what the scriptures teach. The reason why it's so offensive to Peter for Jesus to say, I'm going to suffer, was because if Jesus was going off to suffer, that meant he expected all his followers to go do the same thing. He states it in other places. It's not proper for the boss to work and all the employees to watch. That's not correct. The other way would be okay, right? You could suffer and he could watch. That would be fine. But if he's going to suffer, you by necessity must suffer. Anything else would be untoward. We think of Jesus' death as like a bypass. Like Jesus died and then we bypass death. That's not how the Bible teaches it at all. That is confusing a Semitic view of what substitutionary atonement meant to a very Western individualistic view of what substitutionary atonement means. These are not the same things. Very, very different. We think Jesus as our substitute as being, he did it so we never have to. That's not how Jesus understood it. It's not how Peter understood it. It's not how the scriptures teach it whatsoever. It's exactly the opposite. Jesus dies on the cross so that you can also die on the cross. Jesus suffers so you and I can also suffer with him and in him. For instance, Paul says, therefore we are buried together with him in baptism and into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should walk in newness of life. In Romans 6:8 he says, now if we be dead with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him, knowing that Christ being raised from the dead dieth no more. Death hath no more dominion over him. Paul weaves that into an entire structure in Romans. But the whole thing is based on this point, this very simple point. When Christ died, you died. When Christ suffered, you suffer. When Christ bore the cross, you bore the cross. And it's us dying in him through which we get life. And this is why I said Jesus was going to completely disintegrate, dismember all the fundamental elements, death and life, completely dismantle them and recreate them in an entirely new way. And now when Christians who understand the scriptures, understand what the scriptures are teaching, when we look at death and life, we are not seeing the same thing as everyone else is seeing. Death has been changed. Hebrews says that Jesus took on himself the form of flesh and blood, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. What he's saying here is that Christ came and through his death, he completely remade what death is. And you may think that sounds odd, but he's already talked about this in Mark. He goes to that young girl's house, Jairus' daughter's house. He walks in. Every professional who knows what death is says, that girl's dead. And Jesus said, she's not dead. Because that's not death. She's only sleeping. And they all laugh and mock themselves silly. Because they said, we know what death is. We're around death every single day. And Jesus says, yeah, but death isn't that anymore. Everything has changed. What you think of, naturally speaking, humanly speaking, of what death is and what life is, Jesus is saying, I have remade those categories. nothing is the same anymore. And that required conquering him who had the power of death. And that's the violent upheaval that comes through the gospel. That Jesus comes, you want to know how violently what degree of violence was in that upheaval? Jesus destroyed Satan who had the power of death, so that death could be redone. Think about how death is now presented to us as Christians. I'll just read you one text that points it out. Jesus says in John 5, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life." Through death, by death, into life. We often read that to think that means we bypass it. And that's not what he's saying. You cannot, and the scriptures are crystal clear on this, you cannot have the life of Christ without accepting the death of Christ. Cannot. Jesus concludes our text today essentially with that statement. If you're going to follow me, you must take up your cross. You must die to yourself. There is no path to Christ that doesn't go right through the cross. And that is incredibly offensive. People have been offended by this message for 2,000 years, by the substance of it and by the implications of it. It's really tough. This is why Jesus has been conditioning them to this point, because what he's about to tell them, take up your cross, follow me, suffer for my name, enter into life through the worst way you could possibly imagine, the worst possible execution that we could possibly visualize. That's what it takes. He wants them to be ready to hear that word, because up to now they're having trouble understanding metaphors about leaven and dogs, right? But now he's commissioning them into an entirely new life that somehow, very mysteriously, that I don't understand completely, I don't know that any of us do understand it completely, somehow is completely linked. This new life is linked to the death of Christ. It's almost always found in conjunction. It almost always is spoken of in conjunction with his death. This life that we have in Christ is linked to the death that we suffer in Christ. It's all tied up together. You can't have one without the other. So much so that Paul says in 2 Corinthians, "For we which live are always delivered unto death for Jesus' sake, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our mortal flesh." Christianity is unique in that it neither ignores death nor embraces it. We don't ignore it, we don't pretend it's not there, and we don't embrace it. We believe that Jesus Christ redefined it. He recast it. He reformed it, remade it. And so we look at death very differently than the rest of the world. We should look at death very differently than the rest of the world. Now, all of this that we've said is somewhat summarized in allegory or an illustration with Jesus healing the blind man at the start of our story. Jesus, at the start of the story, does his most offensive healing. Every one of these parts of this text is the most offensive you find in the life of Christ. It really is. And this is his most offensive healing. People have a lot of problem with this healing. Because what happens is, he leads him out of town, he leads him away, it looks like he's going to do his routine, run-of-the-mill miracle, heal the man blind, if you want to call it, if any miracle could be called run-of-the-mill. But it looks like that's what he's going to do. And so he spits, and he puts it on his eyes, and he says, "Do you see?" And the man is like a big downer. He goes, "Well, a little. Not very good. I see men walking around, but they look like trees. Everything's blurry. and not proportionate, and everything is like something's not right. So then Jesus, I don't know, I'm putting a little more into it, but does it again. And then the guy says, oh, that worked. And that's a very difficult miracle to explain. It's like, well, why couldn't he get it right the first time? And I'm not sure I know. But there's a number of connections I would point out to you first in this. First is we talked about it last week, but the connection to Genesis where you have mud and spit and dirt coming together and there's a connection to Genesis. You have the world being made good but not quite right, which is essentially what you have in Genesis, right? But man is the one who discovers that. God makes the whole world and it's great for everyone, but not for man. Because Adam walks around looking around at the world and says, something's not right here. Something, I can't put my finger on it, but something's missing. Everything's out of proportion. Something's just a little off center here. Then you also have the connection to the new creation, right? To us as new creation, where we're healed, but not really. We're transformed, but not really. We're new creatures, but not really. It's like we see, but not super clear. And then you have the connection that we have to life and death. And that we feel very much like this blind man. When I speak of death and life, I assume that many of you felt the way I felt as I wrote this and thought about this and studied this the last 2 weeks. That I kind of understand it, but it's very blurry. I don't get the whole death thing. I'm not sure I understand this whole connection and, what's the point then? It's like Jesus says, I'm going to die for you. And you're like, great. No, I don't have to. He goes, no, now you absolutely have to. And I'm thinking, I see, but it's like real blurry. And everything doesn't seem very proportional. And things don't seem quite right. The very famous Welsh preacher, Martin Lloyd-Jones, when he was preaching on this text, he made an observation that I thought was very helpful. And that is that whenever you're languishing in doubt and in dissatisfaction, you shouldn't pretend that everything is fine. Imagine if the blind man would have said, well, it's not what I expected, but it's better than being blind, so we'll just leave it at that. Don't want to anger him. Well, he'd be walking around still squinting, wondering why everything doesn't look right in the world. No, we should do what he did, and we should be honest with Jesus. You look at yourself as a Christian, and you think, I'm saved, and yet not really. I'm transformed, but not exactly. There's this new creation, and it's all around me, and it's all through me and on me. And yet at the same time, it's like I'm only seeing it through the gates of death, and it's like flitting across, and it's shimmering, and I see just little vistas of it. Every now and then I catch a glimpse of it, and it's like, wow, there it is, and then it's gone, and then all of a sudden, everything just gets dark again, and everything looks disproportionate and out of place, and everything looks exactly right. That's okay. Go tell Jesus that you're not seeing things quite right yet. And Jesus will tell you what he told the blind man. And that's good. He'll tell you, maybe you need to look up. Maybe you need to look up. And maybe if you look up, and you put your eyes on something other than yourself, and put your eyes on something other than those around you, and the things that surround you, and the things of this world, and maybe if you put your eyes on Jesus, you start seeing things proportionally. Maybe the world doesn't look quite right because it isn't quite right yet. But maybe there is a world that is exactly right. And you exactly fit. And everyone looks exactly the way they're supposed to look. Maybe you need to set aside yourself, quit being offended by everything you hear, quit taking everything personally, take up your cross, be heavenly minded, and maybe our vision would get better. Well, next week, we're actually going to take, and I should say take, that's not the right word. We're going to be given by Mark a little view, an unobstructed view of this new world, of what it is exactly right, exactly in proportion. And we're going to get to look at that. And that might restore our vision a little bit. Let's close with prayer. Dear Father, we're very grateful for your word. We're thankful for how you've inspired these writers and their readiness, their willingness, their faith to weave these things together after having struggled to understand them, comprehend them, and then try to communicate them in the best way they could figure out how. And that it has been preserved all the way to us through so many legions of believers who have seen the value in these things, the merit in these stories, in these teachings, in these words, and have faithfully communicated them all the way to us. And it has transformed our hearts the way you transformed the hearts of your disciples. We're thankful that we are part of that long legacy, that family of faith and of new creation. Father, I ask that you would bring our chins upwards and point our eyes heavenwards so that we might see things as they are. We might have a clear and perfect vision of what you're doing and what your purpose is, what your salvation is. We thank you for Jesus, for his love, for his kindness, for his willingness to tell us what we need to hear, regardless of how it makes us feel. I ask that we would have ears to hear, and we would take heed to what we hear. And I ask these things in the name of Jesus, in his great, powerful name.